Hi, I'm Kelly Rusk with Rackspace. Today we're going to talk about Sitecore 9 and a SIF deployment deep dive. As a Sitecore architect, we've seen a lot across the field of Sitecore when it comes to implementation. Sitecore 9 reads a huge dichotomy and new architecture at play and a new implementation framework that can really help you get up to speed if you know the gotchas. So today we're going to speak about kind of what's Sitecore 9 in a nutshell, what is Sitecore SIF, this whole Sitecore installation framework, speak to some of the Sitecore deployment architectures in Sitecore 9, networking considerations, the SIF prerequisites, and there are a few, the SIF components of what makes up this installation framework, XPO, XP1 deployments, as well as XP1 deployment order, self-signed certificates, Azure SQL considerations for those that like to live in the cloud, and some Sitecore SIF gaps and modifications. So Sitecore 9, for those that have not been engaged yet, it's really been re-architected from previous versions of Sitecore to be re-architected to be really more services ready. So when we talk about XConnect, it's really a true API layer, almost a RESTful layer, versus the XDB of the previous incarnations of Sitecore. There are a lot of deployment changes. In the past with Sitecore 8, for example, you may have done a manual zip download or developed your own PowerShell, or use some of the other SIM tools for deployment of Sitecore. Now that we have SIF, and we'll go into deep detail on what this entails, it's a whole new installation framework that really speaks to a role-based initiative around how you deploy Sitecore 9. So when we talk about those roles, we're talking about configuration changes to make a Sitecore role versus deployment architectures. So we'll deep dive into that a little more when we talk about XPO versus XP1. Sitecore 9 also has headless CMS capabilities. Solar Search and some Lucene for operational indexes are preferred. The Shard Map Manager, which if previously you've used Mongo for a lot of your data and analytics collection, you will now can use the Shard Map Manager to collect a lot of your data. There's a new version of Sitecore Commerce for those that really want to integrate and use and leverage the commerce tools. And then we've got a lot of certificates, security, and more on the platform. So how can we have an API layer and have it be secure? So what really is Sitecore SIF? We're going to steal from Sitecore here. And that's starting with Sitecore 9.0. You must use a Sitecore installation framework to install Sitecore. The framework deploys web deploy packages by passing parameters to SIF configuration files through Microsoft PowerShell modules. So where do you get this? It's from an actual Git. So you can actually go out, get a PS repository, use a little bit of code right here on the screen if you can see that. But it's an actual pair of repos, and you'll see the Sitecore installation framework, and this one will actually install the framework and update the module for you. We'll talk about the criticality of that module momentarily. But in essence, what you're getting is a bunch of Sitecore modules that come into place for you to leverage. So let's talk about Sitecore deployment architectures. XPO, that really is your base level. Can I have a development machine with XConnect all in one? So you really end up with two roles in IIS. You'll see the Sitecore sort of role that is your traditional content management, content delivery front end. And then you've got one for XConnect. Works great for development machines, not meant to scale. If you're going to a more production-ready environment, that's when you want to look at XM1, which is CMS-only mode plus your content delivery server. If you really want to scale out and leverage all the beauty that Sitecore 9 has to offer, that's when you get into XP1. And we're talking about scaled roles with a content management server, content delivery server, your processing reporting, and the 5 XConnect roles. These are all critical roles that make up that service layer of XConnect for you to interoperate with. So you have your XConnect collection search, automation operations, reporting, and reference data. Now, what the beauty of the XP1 deployment architecture is that each of these are individual IIS virtual directories and roles. So you can scale out to your heart's desire. You can have these on all separate virtual machines or leave them all on the same box, which allows you to have a lot of different deployment architectures, even if you want to go geo-distributed, which of course would be another discussion. So there are a lot of networking considerations in Sitecore 9. We're dealing with a lot of security, there's a lot at play. One of the first things to notice with the Sitecore installation framework is the generation of self-signed certificates, both client and server, that are installed on the appropriate machines. That depends by role. And you'll see thumbprints in your connection strings and wonder, what does this mean? Well, you have both server and client certs. So your server cert is that HTTPS connection. It's basically like going to a door, where the HTTPS is saying, hey, I know where the door is, and I can securely get to the door. But once you're there at that XConnect door knocking, you need to open that, and that key is the client certificate. And that's where you need to have the thumbprint of your connection strings to ensure that you can have appropriate communication back and forth. So you can pass that data or have the operations, inner operations of XConnect really working in your Sitecore 9 environment. It's critical if you're stumbling a little bit to look at your connection strings and just revisit and ensure that you have your certificates installed in the machines. Inter-machine communication is also critical. So port 1433 and 443 access. So in Sitecore 8, you probably focus on 80, maybe port 8983 and 1433. Sitecore 9, because of the SSL aspects, you're looking at 443 communication. An example, your content delivery server to XConnect is going to need that 443 port open. So basically, all Sitecore servers should have access to SQL over 1433 or your desired port. But don't forget about that 443 because that's critical for your networking communication, especially with the SSL. Now, before you even get to that point, though, you want to consider, can I even resolve the machines that I'm trying to connect you with a certificate? This is where you can leverage host file entries. For example, if you have an endpoint such as HTTPS XConnect collection, you can use that endpoint in a host file entry with your IP. It may be better and maybe a best practice for you, though, to leverage a localized domain controller with a fully qualified domain name for your XConnect collection endpoint. A good example is if you have Azure, maybe you do a machine reset, your IP might change. Updating those host files can kind of be a forgotten path and something you need to update on a regular basis. So from a governance perspective, strongly consider what kind of name resolution you can use to ensure you can communicate with the machines. So don't forget about your Solar servers when it comes time for security. They should be HTTPS as well. You can generate self-signed machine certificates. There's a lot of information on the internet on Solar certs and even the Solar website. Or you can get a public CA and put it into your Solar machine. If you install this public CA or self-signed cert, you must put them in the trusted root store on the Solar machine. And the machines that are going to connect to it if you're using self-signed certs and not a public CA. You also need to ensure that they're in the Solar key store. So you have both the machine layer and the application layer. And the certificate must be in both. There's a lot of interesting articles out there to use the key tool, the key store tool in Java of Solar to deploy that to the key store. But you want to make sure that's locked down for security all the way around your networked Sitecore 9 environment. Self-signed certs via the SIF expire in 1 year. For Solar, it really varies depending on how you deploy it. In all these instances, you may want to consider a public CA for control of your environment. So use SIF, have the self-signed certs to proof out that everything's interconnected, and then apply maybe your public CAs and the appropriate bindings for your endpoints to ensure that everything is connecting as it should. So before you install SIF, we've got a lot of prerequisites to get through. So web administration modules, ASP.NET 4.6, there's a web platform installer for IIS. There's a lot going on here. So this slide will be available to digest, but I also have this on my personal blog, thebitsetbyte.com. But there's a lot of core information you need to have in place first. A lot of this deals with SQL and how you can communicate with SQL properly so that your web deploy from SIF works all the way across the board. So web deploy, let's talk about that for a minute. What are the components of SIF that make this installation framework what it is? We have web deploy packages. Then you've got your PowerShell modules, Sitecore fundamentals, and the Sitecore install framework. They both have different functionality. One is very much focused on the root of operations like self-signed certs and a lot of the core operations such as copying and renaming items. The other is focused on the actual installation of Sitecore itself. You're going to have JSON files with parameters, variables, and tasks. And you have a PowerShell script that has to call all these aspects for it to work. So when we talk about web deploy packages, they are what you think they are. They are full packages that when you extract out the XP1 build, for an example, you're going to see something like this. It's got the archive, SQL commandlets, DACPack files for your SQL servers. Everything that you need is going to be encapsulated within the web deploy package. You're going to have PowerShell modules. These are actually going to call the web deploy and execute a lot of operations, even beyond web deploy. Normal operations to set up the surrounding environment, such as setting up the IIS site. The web deploy is critical for a lot of the components as it relates to your SQL databases. Shard Map Manager is a separate aspect of that, so don't confuse. Don't think the Shard Map Manager is a DACPack per se that's web deployed. It's actually a separate tool. We'll talk about that momentarily. You have a JSON file. This JSON file basically says, okay, PowerShell script, you're going to tell me what inputs I need. I'm going to take this JSON file with all these variables now, all these parameters and tasks. I'm going to pass these to the PowerShell modules, and they're going to execute and probably hit the web deploy packages too. So you've got these 4 components, and here's a good example where you can see the path of the install directory, the actual PS repository. Here's the SIF aspect. So if you looked in the installation manual, you'll see that right there. So you think about the SIF mindset. Your PowerShell is your umbrella. It's got everything under it. You've got your web deploy. You've got your JSON files. You've got your PowerShell modules, and then your own personalized scripts. These 4 components are critical to ensuring that you can deploy from SIF. You can modify your JSON files. We'll talk about that in a few slides to maybe add some new functionality or maybe make up for a gap that SIF currently has in place. But at the end of the day, you have to remember there are 4 legs to this chair if you're going to sit in the SIF world. PowerShell script that you have is going to pass variables to the JSON file. The JSON file is going to interoperate with the PowerShell modules, and your PowerShell modules are going to leverage and use web deploy. So let's look at an XPO deployment. We're talking about this whole aspect of your PowerShell script now. You can see here that they've got prefixes and a lot of variables that get passed in the JSON file. This is your opportunity to put in maybe some personalized values that you want to have in place. Maybe your site name, the Solar URL. All these values are matching parameters in the JSON file. So if you don't know what to put into your script, when you call SIF, look at the JSON file. And remember, XP1, there are multiple files to consider. XPO deployment, as we talked about previously, that is meant really for development. It's an all-in-one XConnect. Works great for development. If you go into a scaled role, however, in XP1, you want to have some other considerations. So on this slide, you can see where I'm actually getting to the PowerShell Gallery. I'm installing SQL Server PowerShell, the support modules that I'm calling. I'm going to get SIF from Git and check for any updates. So I have the most recent module of SIF installed. And there are details that Sitecore hosts about SIF and the module differences, like 1.1 versus 1.2 and what the offerings are. The next thing I'm doing here in this example, I've got an XConnect collection rule. So Sitecore 9 XP1 scaled, where I'm actually installing the client certificate first, and Sitecore provides you with an awesome little JSON file that you can call. Once I've got that certificate, I pass on all my parameters, including the certificate name, to the greater SIF installation for this role. So let's revisit that. What did I just do? I went to the PowerShell Gallery and said, you know what? I need to ensure that I can have the necessary modules to run my PowerShell. I need to get the actual Sitecore installation framework, and I'll put it in your PowerShell directories on your machine. I need to have my client certificate generated first, and then I can pass that right in to the role instance and all the parameters that I'm putting in place to ensure that I have a successful deployment of my Sitecore 9 XP1 role. There is an order that you must follow. So you want to install SQL, enable database contained users. Sitecore 9 is very database contained user heavy, with the exception of a collection user which resides outside for the purposes of the Shard Map Manager. You want to install Solar in your Solar cores and have those ready. So when you install your XConnect roles, they can interoperate and deal with any kind of schema they need to that Solar has existing. You're going to install processing reporting, your CMS, then finally your content delivery server. So basically you're going from the ground up from your backend all the way to public facing as you install these roles. They have certificates that need to communicate with each other. And if you do this in reverse order, you'll find that you have to do a lot of manual work. So please follow the steps, follow the deployment order that you need to, and ensure that if you're using master slave or any kind of Solar Cloud aspects, that Solar is operating as such a critical aspect for your operations. So post these roles, get into that content management server, re-index, and remember also for the XDB index in Solar, you're going to need to do a little special index rebuild. Instructions, of course, are on the scaled Sitecore guide. Deep diving into XP1 self-signed certs. Because this is a scaled role, we've got XConnect with 5 of them. These are essentially endpoints you need to ensure that these roles can communicate over 443. We talked about that during networking considerations. Once Sitecore knows where an endpoint is, it needs the server and client certs for the endpoint on its machine for the proper handshake. So if you're on your content management server and you can't connect to XConnect, open up your MMC, look at your certificates and see, hey, do I have the roles here? Did Sitecore install them? The reality is that when you install Sitecore, unless you're doing customization with Sitecore SIF, it's going to install the certificates it needs on its local machine. So if you're doing XConnect, it's going to have all the XConnect certs. You're going to need to copy those into the content management server if it's a separate device. Same with the content delivery server. So any of these extra roles outside of XConnect, wherever they are, it needs a certificate. So you don't have them on machine, get them onto the machine to ensure you have intra-machine communication. And that's where Sitecore can really know where an endpoint is. Your certificate is encrypted for SSL. And that's where you need to remember you have thumbprints in your connection strings. So when you see that kind of weird HTTPS connection string, look for that thumbprint. You'll know that the client handshake is occurring. If you don't know what certificates you have on your machine, open up PowerShell, run the following command, get child item, put your path in as local machine my. It's going to show you all your certs, all your thumbprints, and then you can update accordingly. But of course, you need to make sure your certificates are on the machine. It's a huge mistake a lot of people make when they do a scaled deployment. Trusted root certificates matter as well. So you want to ensure you have your trusted root certificate beyond your server HTTPS. Usually, if you do Sitecore SIF, it's going to say Sitecore do not trust. So you know that is a Sitecore self-signed cert. And that's why you might want to have a public CA instead. You want to go into IIS, set up the SSL settings. That's per IIS site to allow for client certificates. Your client certs need the application pools added to them. And look at this installation documentation of your guide to see that. So basically, if you go into your MMC console, open up certificates as a snap-in, you can manage private keys, and right there under those tabs, you're going to see the opportunity to add the application pool that you need for Sitecore to communicate all the way down. If you don't have that, when you try to connect over, the certificate's going to say, well, I don't know you. App pool, application pool. That application pool is your broker. So when you have the connection strings and those thumbprints, it uses the machine's application pool to validate against the certificates on your machine. Again, Solar uses SSL, so make sure you got the machine keys and the Solar key store in place, and check the installation guide for which server and client certificates belong on each server. Example, your content management server, it's going to connect to 4 of the 5 XConnect roles. So bear that in mind as you're copying and moving the certificates around your environment. Azure SQL. So as we go into the cloud and maybe have an Azure SQL backend, there are some considerations. As of date, there is no straight SIF to Azure SQL deployment yet. That means when you run SIF and it has all the DAC pack files in the web deploy, it cannot deploy to Azure SQL with technical confidence. So what you want to do instead is one option you can consider. You can import your DAC pack files from manual zip download into your local SQL server. Then export these to Azure SQL as backpack files. You may want to just keep those around as backpacks for future use. You're going to add a skip in your JSON file. So remember we talked about the 4 components of SIF, where your PowerShell script calls the JSON file? You can modify that JSON file and put a little skip, as I've noted here, to skip the web deployment of your DACPack files because you've already created your databases in Azure SQL. At this point, it's just a matter of connecting to them. You want to change the Shard Map Manager DACPack also if you're leveraging Azure SQL. So what's the Shard Map Manager? It's this nifty little tool that is an EXE, and it allows you to deploy these shards, multiple shards if you want to. By default, you're getting 2 shards and a Map Manager database. And what this allows you to do is you have that raw analytics data coming in. The Shard Map Manager infrastructure within SQL is going to make sure that it stores data in one of the 2 shards. That gets picked up by all the processing, marketing, automation aspects, eventually ends up in the reporting role, so you can actually see your data outputted. But this is your raw data. In the past, maybe you've used MongoDB, but this is where your raw data is now stored, all that analytical goodness. We're not going to discuss GDPR and some of those aspects, but be aware of the intellectual property and data sovereignty issues before you go too deep into taking analytic data, especially in a geo-distributed environment. The Shard Map Manager, because it is a separate tool, it still uses a DACPack file to deploy. So in your JSON file, this is in the XConnect collection JSON role of XP1, you want to change it from Database SQL DACPack to the Database SQL Azure DACPack. Again, if you inspect the web deploy packages, you will see these DACPacks listed. The value of that is, while you're skipping the other DACPacks, you can still deploy your shards to Azure SQL with some minor modification. And more on the Shard Map Manager, I've put a link to my blog post. Please comment, ask questions, reach out with any questions. There's a lot of cool things you can do with the Shard Map Manager. So let's talk about Sitecore SIF gaps and modifications. Sitecore can't build everything for you, nor should they. There are some natural gaps and modifications you can make to personalize and ensure that your environment meets your needs while still staying in the parameters of a secure, stable, and scalable Sitecore 9 environment. So you might want to install Sitecore to another directory besides init pub. That's the default. We just talked about skipping web deploy for the Azure SQL backend if you're using Azure SQL. You might want to use SQL session state databases instead of Redis or some other session state storage. Secondary reporting databases. If you're going to rebuild your reporting database, you need a secondary reporting database. SIF doesn't deploy these. They have DACPack files that you can leverage, and they are in there. There's a sessions one you can actually leverage for deploying. So a little modification, you can deploy your sessions databases, set up preview databases, reporting databases, anything you need to really meet your criteria for your scaled environment. You can automate your installation certificates across servers. It's something at Rackspace we do for all of our clients. Our Sitecore SIF methodology is use Sitecore SIF, don't deviate from Sitecore's installation, but let's automate the manual processes that Sitecore has in an installation guide for speed to market and ensuring that we're not making mistakes via manual entry. So a good example of that is ensuring that the certificates can go from XConnect to the CMS and CDS servers. Maybe you can pop your certificates after you create them into blob storage and then import them down later when you create the next role. There's a multitude of options here, and it's really up to you on how you want to deploy this. But again, these gaps and modifications exist. Really think of them as opportunities. Opportunities to leverage Sitecore and really build out this platform the way you need it to meet your criteria. There's a lot of other activities that can leverage the SIF modules. So look at those 2 Sitecore modules, part of those 4 components of Sitecore SIF, because there's a lot of powerful PowerShell, not to be redundant, that you could leverage maybe to do some of your automation, maybe even set up some of your DevOps infrastructure. So leverage the beauty that SIF already encapsulates in those modules. If you get intimate with them, you will understand the JSON files better, understand what's being called, and you can even create some custom JSON files to call just specific aspects of the SIF. And again, that allows you a lot of power as you go to develop this environment. And when it comes down to that, you really need to decide, what should I do here? Should I develop against SIF that could change with each new release of Sitecore? Or do I maybe just kind of leave it the way it is? Or maybe write my own PowerShell to augment some of this? So you think about interoperation there. You want to think about what's governable for me, what works for me, in order to ensure that at the end of the day I'm not rewriting again and again and again. You don't want to be in a constant state of redeveloping your deployment architecture. So here's a good example of a gap that we do as modification. So we don't want the init pub to be our default root. We want this to maybe be a different directory. So what we do is we have this parameter, and we're going to add a new parameter called website path. And we're going to put a default value in there, which is the init pub root. And the description, you put anything you want. Maybe, hey, we want this to be the actual website path that we're going to deploy to. So now you got this parameter in your JSON file. You're going to put a new variable in your XP1 JSON file. So those parameters we saw earlier in your PowerShell script, when you call the Sitecore SIF, if you've got it in the JSON file, it is now a variable you can use within your PowerShell script. So example here, site physical path, parameter, website path. That matches my parameter. And then finally, when you call it, here's your SIF right here. Here's your SIF call. You can see where I'm putting the website path in right there. That's where I've got a variable. Maybe that's the S drive. Maybe I want to call S drive, Sitecore Content Delivery Server. And that's where I want to install my Sitecore. A simple modification, but if you leverage this model, you have 3 key aspects, you can really modify the JSON, modify the SIF in a way that really augments your environment to the way you need it. So with that, we want to wish you luck and get out there, get engaged with SIF. I know we just threw a lot at you. At the end of the day, start small. Maybe start with an XPO environment. Get used to calling these 4 different components. Inspect the web deployment packages. And if you have any questions, reach out. The community is here. We're leveraging SIF. It's a great tool, and we can't wait to see what the future holds for us.